He didn't need your money. That was the strange part. He was already rich, already famous, already one of the most respected men on Wall Street. He had built a legitimate brokerage firm from nothing, helped create the NASDAQ stock exchange, served as its chairman. He had a penthouse in Manhattan, a villa in the south of France, a yacht named Bull. He had everything, and yet, for 30 years, he ran the largest financial fraud in human history. $64.8 billion. Stolen from banks, hedge funds, charities, Holocaust survivors, Nobel Prize winners, and ordinary retirees who trusted him with everything they had saved in their entire lives. The strangest part wasn't how he did it. The strangest part was this. People begged him to take their money. He turned most of them away, and the ones he let in felt chosen. That feeling of being chosen cost them everything. Bernard Lawrence Madoff was born on April 29, 1938, in Queens, New York. His family was working class, Jewish, unremarkable. His father had tried and failed at several businesses. His mother briefly registered as a broker-dealer with the SEC, then disappeared from the records. Young Bernie watched his family struggle with money, and he decided, early and with complete certainty, that he would never struggle the same way. He was not the smartest kid in the room. He was not a mathematical genius. He was not a visionary technologist. What Bernie Madoff had, from the very beginning, was something rarer and more dangerous than any of those things. He understood what people wanted to feel. At 22, while studying at Hofstra University, he started Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities with $5,000 he had saved from working as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems. His father-in-law, Saul Alpern, an accountant, sent him his first clients. Small amounts, modest people, but Bernie was careful with them, and word spread. In those early years, the business was legitimate. Madoff became a pioneer in electronic trading. His firm was one of the first to use computers to execute stock transactions, bypassing the traditional floor traders on the New York Stock Exchange. He helped build the infrastructure that eventually became NASDAQ. By the 1980s, his firm was processing up to $1 billion in trades per day. He was not a fraud. He was genuinely one of the most important figures in the modernization of American financial markets. And that is what made everything that came next so perfectly, devastatingly effective. Because when Bernie Madoff told you he had a special investment strategy that generated consistent 10 to 12% annual returns regardless of market conditions, you believed him. Not because you were stupid, because everything else about him was real. The strategy had a name: split strike conversion. It sounded sophisticated, technical, credible. The idea was that Madoff would buy a basket of stocks from the S&P 100, then hedge the position using options contracts. In theory, this could smooth out returns and reduce volatility. Real funds used variations of this approach. It was plausible. It was also completely fabricated. Bernie Madoff never executed a single trade for his investment advisory clients. Not one. The money came in, was deposited in a single account at J.P. Morgan Chase, and sat there, or was paid out to earlier investors as returns. The account statements his clients received every month were fictional documents, printed in his office on 17th floor of the Lipstick Building in Midtown Manhattan, by a small team of employees who had no idea what they were really doing. The 17th floor was separated from the rest of the firm. Legitimate trading operations happened on the 18th and 19th floors. Staff from those floors were not permitted on 17. The people who worked on 17, processing the fake statements, maintaining the fictional records, were told they were running a special, confidential operation. Some of them suspected something was wrong. None of them asked the question out loud. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about the Madoff fraud. It required dozens of people to simply not ask questions. And in a culture where asking questions could cost you your job, your bonus, your access to one of the most prestigious firms on Wall Street, most people didn't ask. But here is the detail that should make your blood run cold. In 1999, 9 years before the collapse, A financial analyst named Harry Markopolos sat down with a spreadsheet and a copy of Madoff's publicly available returns. Within 4 hours, he had concluded that the numbers were mathematically impossible. No legitimate trading strategy could produce returns that consistent, that smooth, through bull markets and bear markets alike, without a single bad year. Markopolos filed a formal complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission. He titled it, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." The SEC did nothing. He filed again in 2001. Nothing. Again in 2005, with a 19-page detailed analysis naming Madoff specifically and explaining, step by step, exactly how the fraud was being executed. The SEC sent 2 junior investigators to Madoff's offices. Bernie charmed them in a single afternoon. They left satisfied. He was Bernie Madoff. He had chaired NASDAQ. He had helped write the rules they enforced. The idea that he was a criminal was simply not something their minds could accommodate. Markopolos later told Congress that he was afraid for his life during those years. He varied his routes to work. He kept a gun in his car. He was certain that if Madoff discovered he was being investigated, he would be killed. The SEC, meanwhile, was not afraid of anything, because they were not taking anything seriously. This is what institutional failure looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not villainous. Just a series of small, comfortable decisions to believe the person in front of you rather than the numbers on the page. Now let's talk about who gave Bernie Madoff their money, because this is where the story stops being about one criminal and starts being about something much larger. Fairfield Greenwich Group, a fund of funds based in New York and Greenwich, placed $7.5 billion with Madoff. $7.5 billion. They collected fees from their own investors for the privilege of accessing Madoff's returns. Their due diligence consisted largely of having lunch with Bernie and accepting his assurances that everything was in order. Banco Santander, one of the largest banks in Europe, had $3.1 billion exposed. HSBC had $1 billion. Nomura Securities in Japan, $304 million. Kingate Global Fund, $1.8 billion. Tremont Group, $3.3 billion. The list goes on and on and on. These were not naive individuals. These were professional institutions with entire departments dedicated to risk assessment and due diligence. They had analysts, lawyers, auditors, and they all failed because all of them wanted to believe, because Madoff's returns were extraordinary, because access to his fund was restricted, which made it feel exclusive, safe, prestigious. Exclusivity is one of the most powerful psychological forces in finance. The harder something is to get into, the more people want it, and the less critically they evaluate it once they're inside. Madoff understood this better than anyone. He regularly turned away new investors. He made people wait. He sometimes called clients and told them he was closing the fund to new money, which caused a wave of panic among the excluded and a wave of pride among those already in. I'm already in. I made the cut. It was fraud engineered around human psychology, around our need to feel special, around our desperate desire to believe that someone, somewhere, has figured out how to make money reliably in an unreliable world. There were warning signs for anyone who looked. Madoff's auditor, the firm responsible for independently verifying his financial statements, was a 3-person accounting shop in a strip mall in Rockland County, New York. One of the 3 partners was 78 years old and essentially retired. The second was a secretary. The third was a single accountant named David Freeling, who had told the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants that he did not conduct audits. Think about that for a moment. The auditor for what was supposed to be one of the world's most sophisticated investment operations, managing tens of billions of dollars, was a man who had officially declared that he did not do audits. Nobody checked. Or rather, many people could have checked. Nobody wanted to. Because the returns were too good. Because Bernie was too respected. Because questioning him meant admitting that the foundation of your own success might be built on something that didn't exist. By December 2008, the foundation was cracking everywhere. The financial crisis had hit. Lehman Brothers had collapsed in September. Markets were in free fall. Investors all over the world were pulling money out of everything they could reach. Redemption requests flooded into Madoff's office. $7 billion in a single month. He had nowhere near that amount of actual cash. The machine that had run for 30 years was about to stop. On the evening of December 9, 2008, Bernie Madoff called his sons Mark and Andrew into his Manhattan apartment. Mark, 44, and Andrew, 42. Both worked in the legitimate trading operations of his firm. They had grown up watching their father build an empire. They loved him. They were proud of him. They had never been allowed on the 17th floor. Bernie told them he was finished, that it had all been one big lie, that there was no investment strategy, no trades, no portfolio, that everything their clients believed they owned did not exist. It's all just one big lie, he said. Basically, a giant Ponzi scheme. His sons sat in silence for a moment. Then they left the apartment. They did not call their father's lawyer. They did not call the firm's compliance officer. They called their own attorney, and through him, the next morning, they called the FBI. Bernie Madoff was arrested at his apartment at 7 a.m. on December 11, 2008. He offered no resistance. He had been expecting it. What followed was a devastation that no single number can fully capture. The official figure, $64.8 billion, represents what investors believed they had in their accounts. The actual cash that had been deposited over the decades was approximately $17 billion. The difference, nearly $48 billion, was fictional profit that existed only on paper statements Madoff's office had been printing for 30 years. But behind every number was a person. Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Peace Prize winner and Holocaust survivor, lost his entire personal fortune and the foundation he had built in his name, $15.2 million. He had trusted Madoff because Madoff was a pillar of the Jewish community, a major philanthropist, a man who spoke at the same events Wiesel attended. He was a con artist, Wiesel said afterward. A thief. What he did was a sin. Hundreds of charities and foundations were wiped out overnight. Some had placed their entire endowments with Madoff because his returns had allowed them to give away more money year after year. The Robert Y. Lapin Charitable Foundation, which funded Jewish youth programs, lost everything and closed the next day. Jet Foundation, which funded justice and human rights programs, lost everything and closed within weeks. Thousands of individual investors, retirees, teachers, doctors, small business owners opened their December statements and found that decades of savings had vanished. Not decreased, not fallen in value. Vanished. They had never existed. Dozens of people lost everything they had. At least 2 people took their own lives. René Thierry Magon de la Villouche, a French aristocrat and fund manager who had placed $1.4 billion of his clients' money with Madoff, was found dead at his desk on December 23, 2008, 12 days after the arrest. He had slashed his wrists. He left no note, but those who knew him said he believed he had failed the people who trusted him and could not live with it. Bernie Madoff pleaded guilty on March 12, 2009. He stood in a federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan and read a prepared statement. "I am deeply sorry and ashamed," he said. He was sentenced to 150 years in prison. He was 71 years old. His son Mark hanged himself on December 11, 2010, exactly 2 years after his father's arrest. He had never been charged with any crime. He had been the one to turn his father in. His son Andrew died of lymphoma in 2014. He had told people that the stress of the years after the fraud had accelerated his illness. He was 48. His wife Ruth, who had lived with him and managed household accounts but claimed no knowledge of the fraud, was allowed to keep $2.5 million from what had originally been a much larger personal fortune. She later said she had contemplated suicide in the days after the arrest. Bernie Madoff died in federal prison on April 14, 2021. He was 82 years old. He had spent the last years of his life with kidney disease, applying repeatedly for compassionate release and being denied each time. The recovery process took years. A court-appointed trustee named Irving Picard spent over a decade pursuing every dollar that could be traced. He sued banks, funds, family members, and anyone who had withdrawn more from Madoff's accounts than they had originally put in. People who had technically profited from the scheme at the expense of others without knowing it. By 2023, Picard had recovered approximately $14.7 billion, nearly 90 cents on every dollar of actual cash that had been invested. It was a remarkable legal achievement. But for the people who had believed their statements, who had planned their retirements and their children's educations around numbers that never existed, there was no full recovery. Not financial, not psychological. So what does this story mean? What do you take from it? Not the obvious lesson. Don't trust anyone. That's not a useful way to live. The real lesson is about the gap between consistency and credibility. Bernie Madoff's most powerful weapon was not charm, not connections, not even his reputation. It was the smoothness of his numbers. Consistent returns in an inconsistent world feel like safety. They feel like intelligence. They feel like someone has cracked the code that everyone else is struggling with. And that feeling, that relief, is exactly when your critical thinking shuts down. Every legitimate investment in human history has had bad years. Every single one. Markets go down. Strategies fail. Conditions change. Anyone who tells you otherwise, anyone whose performance looks too smooth, too consistent, too good across too many different market environments, is either lying or about to be proven wrong in a very public way. The second lesson is institutional. The SEC had the information. Harry Markopolos handed it to them on a plate 9 years before the collapse. They didn't act, not because they were corrupt, but because they were captured. Captured by the assumption that someone as prominent, as connected, as professionally decorated as Bernie Madoff simply could not be a criminal. The institution had no mechanism for questioning its own assumptions. Every major financial scandal in history, Enron, WorldCom, Theranos, FTX, has included this moment. The moment when someone raised a red flag, and the institution looked at the flag, looked at the person waving it, and decided the person was the problem. And the third lesson, the hardest one, is about us. We want to believe that someone has figured it out. That there is a strategy, a system, a genius with access to information we don't have, who can make money grow reliably while the rest of the world struggles. That desire is human. It's not stupidity, it's hope. Bernie Madoff sold hope. That's all a Ponzi scheme ever sells. And as long as that desire exists in us, the desire for safety, for certainty, for someone who has the answer, there will be people willing to sell it. The money can be recovered. The $14.7 billion Picard retrieved proved that. What cannot be recovered is the trust. The 30 years of statements that felt like security. The retirement that existed only on paper. The foundation that could have helped thousands of people emptied in a single morning. That's the true cost of a fraud that lasted 30 years, not $64.8 billion. The cost was 30 years of people sleeping soundly, believing they were safe. They weren't.